Marie Delphine McCarty was born in New Orleans on March 19, 1787, as one of 5 children. Her father was Louis Barthélemy de McCarty, whose father Barthélemy McCarthy brought the family to New Orleans from Ireland around 1730 during the French colonial period. Her mother was Marie-Jeanne Larrable, also known as the Widow Leconte, as her marriage to Louis B. McCarty was her second. Both of Delphine's parents were prominent in the town's European Creole community. Her uncle by marriage, Esteban Rodriguez Moreau, was governor of the Spanish-American provinces of Louisiana and Florida during 1785 to 1791, and her cousin, Augustine de McCarty, was mayor of New Orleans from 1815 to 1820. Delphine was only 4 years of age when the Haitian Revolution erupted in 1791, something that made slaveholders in the southern United States and the Caribbean very afraid. Delphine's uncle had been murdered in 1771 by his slaves, and the revolution caused many slaveholders to abuse slaves even more harshly out of fear of insurrection. On June 11, 1800, at age 13, Delphine married Don Ramon de López y Angulo, a high-ranking Spanish royal officer, at the St. Louis Cathedral in New Orleans. In 1804, while en route to Madrid with Delphine, who was then pregnant, Don Ramon suddenly died in Havana. A few days after his death, Delphine gave birth to his daughter, Marie Borja Delphine López y Angulo de la Candelaria, nicknamed Borquita. The widowed Delphine and her child returned to New Orleans. In June 1808, aged around 21, Delphine married Jean Blanc, a prominent banker, merchant, lawyer, and legislator. At the time of the marriage, Blanc purchased a house at 409 Royal Street in New Orleans for the family, which became known later as the Villa Blanc. Delphine had 4 children by Blanc, named Marie-Louise Pauline, Louise-Marie Laure, Marie-Louise Jean, and Jean-Pierre Paulin Blanc. In 1816, her husband, Jean Blanc, also died suddenly. 9 years later, on June 25, 1825, Delphine married her third husband, a physician named Leonard Louis Nicolas LaLaurie, who was 15 years her junior. In 1831, she bought property at 1140 Royal Street, which she managed in her own name with little involvement of her husband. In 1832, she had a 2-story mansion built there, complete with attached slave quarters. She lived there with her third husband and 2 of her daughters, and maintained a central position in New Orleans society. The marriage soon showed signs of strain. However, on November 16, 1832, Delphine petitioned the First Judicial District Court for a separation from bed and board of her husband, in which Delphine claimed that LaLaurie had treated her in such a manner as to render their living together unsupportable, claims which her son and 2 of her daughters by Jean Blanc confirmed. The separation does not seem to have been permanent, as Dr. LaLaurie was present at the Royal Street House on April 10, 1834, the day of the fire. Accounts of Delphine LaLaurie's treatment of her slaves between 1831 and 1834 are mixed. Harriet Martineau, writing in 1838 and recounting tales told to her by New Orleans residents during her 1836 visit, claimed that slaves of LaLaurie were observed to be singularly haggard and wretched. However, in public appearances LaLaurie was seen to be generally polite to black people and solicitous of the health of those enslaved. Funeral registers between 1830 and 1834 document the deaths of 12 slaves at the Royal Street Mansion, although the causes of death are not mentioned and infectious diseases could easily have been the cause. These 12 deaths include Bonne, a cook and laundress, and her 4 children, Juliet, age 13, Florence, age 10, Jules, age 6, and Leontine, age 4. Court records of the time showed that LaLaurie freed 2 slaves, Jean Louis in 1819 and de Vince in 1832. Martineau wrote that public rumors about LaLaurie's mistreatment of slaves on her property were sufficiently widespread that a local lawyer was dispatched to Royal Street to remind LaLaurie of the laws for the upkeep of slaves. During this visit, the lawyer found no evidence of wrongdoing or mistreatment of slaves by LaLaurie. Martineau also recounted other tales of LaLaurie's cruelty that were current among New Orleans residents in about 1836. She said that, subsequent to the visit of the lawyer, one of LaLaurie's neighbors saw an 8-year-old slave girl fall to her death from the roof of the Royal Street Mansion while trying to avoid punishment from a whip-wielding LaLaurie. The body was subsequently buried on the mansion grounds. The girl had been brushing Delphine's hair when she hit a snag, causing LaLaurie to grab a whip and chase her. According to Martineau, this incident led to an investigation of the LaLauries, in which they were found guilty of illegal cruelty and forced to forfeit 9 slaves of their household. These 9 enslaved people were bought back by the LaLauries through an intermediary relative and returned to the Royal Street residence. LaLaurie also beat her daughters when they attempted to feed the slaves. On April 10, 1834, a fire broke out in the LaLaurie residence on Royal Street, starting in the kitchen. When the police and fire marshals got there, they found the cook, a 70-year-old woman, chained to the stove by her ankle. She later said that she had set the fire as a suicide attempt because she feared being punished. She said that slaves taken to the uppermost room never came back. Bystanders responding to the fire attempted to enter the quarters of those enslaved to ensure that everyone had been evacuated. Upon being refused the keys by the LaLauries, the bystanders broke down the doors to the quarters and found 7 slaves, more or less horribly mutilated, suspended by the neck, with their limbs apparently stretched and torn from one extremity to the other, and they had been imprisoned there for some months. One of those who entered the premises was Judge Jean-François Canonge, who subsequently deposed after having found in the LaLaurie mansion, among others, a woman wearing an iron collar and an old slave woman who had received a very deep wound on her head, and who was too weak to be able to walk. Canonge said that when he questioned LaLaurie's husband about those enslaved on the property, he was told in an insolent manner that some people had better stay at home rather than come to others' houses to dictate laws and meddle with other people's business. The slaves were emaciated, showed signs of being flayed with a whip, were bound in restrictive postures, and wore spiked iron collars which kept their heads in static positions. When the discovery of the abused slaves became widely known, a mob of local citizens attacked the LaLaurie residence and demolished and destroyed everything upon which they could lay their hands. A sheriff and his officers were called upon to disperse the crowd, but by the time the mob left, the property had sustained major damage, with scarcely anything remaining but the walls. The slaves were taken to a local jail, where they were available for public viewing. The Bee reported that by April 12 up to 4,000 people had attended to view the slaves to convince themselves of their sufferings. The Pittsfield Sun claimed that 2 of the slaves found in the mansion had died since their rescue. LaLaurie's life after the 1834 fire is not well documented. LaLaurie fled New Orleans during the mob violence that followed the fire, taking a coach to the waterfront and traveling by schooner to Mobile, Alabama, and then to Paris. Living with his mother and 2 sisters, Pauline and Laure, in exile in Paris, Delphine's son Paulin Blanc wrote on August 15, 1842, to his brother-in-law, Auguste de Lassus, stating that Delphine was serious about returning to New Orleans and had thought about doing so for a long time. Blanc wrote in the same letter that he believed that his mother never had any idea about the reason for her departure from New Orleans. Despite Delphine's bad mood and her determination to return to New Orleans, the disapproval of her children and other relatives had apparently been enough for her to cancel her plan. The circumstances of LaLaurie's death are also unclear. In 1888, George Washington Cable recounted a popular but unsubstantiated story that LaLaurie had died in France in a boar hunting accident. In the late 1930s, Eugene Backus, who served as sexton to St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 until 1924, discovered an old, cracked copper plate in Alley 4 of the cemetery. The inscription on the plate read, Madame LaLaurie, née Marie Delphine McCarthy, décédée à Paris, le 7 December, 1842, à l'âge de 6. The English translation of the inscription reads, Madame LaLaurie, born Marie Delphine McCarthy, died in Paris, December 7, 1842, at the age of 6. According to the French archives of Paris, however, LaLaurie died on December 7, 1849, at the age of 62. If you found this video intriguing, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more captivating content.